Hey there, and welcome to Comedy Recapped. Today we'll be examining 2008's Management. Beware, spoilers ahead, watch out, and take care. Mike goes about his job as a manager at his parents' motel. Later that day, Mike returns to the motel from a yoga class. He finds a young lady checking in. He checks her out as she checks into her room. Later that night, Mike's parents leave the motel's management to Mike as they return home for the night. Mike waits for his parents' car to drive off, then begins searching through some boxes in the motel's storage till he gets what he's searching for, a bottle of wine. Sue, the lady who had checked in earlier that day, hears a knock at her door in the middle of the night. She opens the door to find Mike, who smiles and says, "Hi, I have your complimentary bottle welcome gift. It's wine." Mike mentions that he's with management and that the wine is on the house. The following night, Mike knocks on Sue's door with a different bottle of wine. Once Sue opens the door, he mentions that the bottle of champagne is a complimentary gift for guests who stay for 2 nights. Mike opens the bottle and pours it for both him and Sue. He mentions that Sue has a great butt. Smiling, he states that he noticed her butt the moment she walked and checked in. Sue thanks him and then asks if he does this often, to which Mike replies, "Very rarely." He makes it clear that his love life is like a piece of Swiss cheese. Most of it is missing and what's left just stinks. Sue also asks if it ever works, and Mike replied that it doesn't. She takes a look at him and she asks that if he got to touch her butt, would that constitute it working? To which Mike replies in the affirmative. Sue promptly bends over, saying that he can touch her butt as long as he leaves her room right after. There's some sexual harassment here somewhere. The following day, right before Sue checks out of the motel, Mike walks up to get her phone number or email, only to have her decline. Sue sits in her car for a while as she takes in her surroundings. Sue sighs, then steps out of the car and walks into the laundry room where she had seen Mike walk in a while ago. She walks up to him and grabs his face, kisses him, and begins making out with him. They have a quickie, and after that, Sue gets in her car and then drives off. Later that night, Mike books a one-way cash ticket to Maryland where Sue works. The next day, he arrives at Corporate Bliss, the company where Sue works. Surprised at the sudden visit, Sue asks what he's doing at her workplace, and Mike replies, "I'm here to see you." Mike goes with her to a football match where he makes a fool of himself. Later that evening, Mike helps her hand out food vouchers to the homeless. The next day, Mike informs Sue that he had bought a one-way ticket to see her, and when Sue asks why he'd do something so stupid, he replies that he didn't have enough money. Sue promises to lend Mike the money as long as he leaves that day. Mike manages to convince Sue to take the day off, allowing them to spend the day having fun and visiting parks in the city. At the end of the day, Sue escorts Mike to the bus terminal and watches him leave for his hometown. A month later, Sue goes on a business trip again and decides to lodge at Mike's parents' motel. Ecstatic at her sudden appearance, Mike gets to spend the entire day with her at her yoga class and then have dinner. Sue mentions that she recently broke up with her boyfriend Django, who is an ex-rock punk. After dinner, Mike asks Sue to go with him to visit his sick mother. Mike's mother, Trish, inquires about Sue's family. She mentions that her father is out of the picture and that he lives in Northern California alone. Trish discreetly tells Mike after Sue leaves the room that she likes Sue, but she seems like a long shot for Mike. The next day, as she checks out of the motel, Sue mentions that it isn't going to work out between them, but she'll keep in better touch this time around. Tragically, Trish passes away a while later. After her funeral, Mike's father hands him a necklace stating that it was her favorite, and that she requested for him to give it to Mike once she had passed on. Shockingly, Mike pawns the necklace and uses the cash to travel to Maryland to visit Sue. He finds out, however, that Sue had moved from Maryland to Washington State after quitting her job. Mike then travels to Washington State, where he lives as a homeless man for a while, until he gets a job and a place to stay with the help of Al, the son of a restaurant owner. Al asks Mike why he'd moved to Washington, and Mike explains that the lady he is in love with moved to Washington to be with her ex-boyfriend. Al sympathizes with Mike as Mike explains that the ex-boyfriend is an ex-punk. They go over to Django's mansion where they hide behind a bush and spy on both Django and Sue, who seem to be having a nice time together. A couple of days later, Al introduces Mike to a dude who went to flight school. He explains that he can help him get into Django's mansion. Mike goes along with the plan and parachutes out a plane with the help of the dude. He lands inside a pool right in front of Sue and gets shot by Django. Mike wakes up in the hospital and is informed that the bullets used by Django were non-lethal. Django invites Mike and Al over for dinner as an apology. At dinner, Django mentions that Sue informed him that Mike's a painter and that they had met on her last business trip. Later that night, Django gets drunk, allowing Sue to sneak out to go clubbing with Mike and Al. A couple of days later, Django barges into the restaurant where Mike works and punches him in the face. He mentions that he's watching Mike and wants him to stay away from Sue. That night, Mike and Al ride over to Django's home on bicycles. They stop in front of the house and Mike plays a song for Sue where he confesses his love for her. A day later, Sue visits Mike in the basement and informs him that she's getting married to Django that weekend. Mike is crushed and, in his heartbroken state, asks why she's getting married to Django, to which Sue replies that she's pregnant and is going to have the baby. Mike begins crying and yells at Sue and tells her to get the heck out of his basement. Ultimately, Django gets married to Sue that weekend, which leads Mike to become a Buddhist monk, just to hide from the pain of losing Sue. At the monastery, a high-ranking Buddhist priest speaks to Mike. He advises Mike to move on and let go. Mike, soon after, returns home and decides to make some changes in his life, like asking his father to sell the motel if it's not making him happy. He then receives a letter from Sue telling him how she's sorry for how things ended. She also thanks him, stating that because of him, she's no longer who she was. Some days later, Jerry hands over the deed of the motel to Mike, stating that it's his birthright. They then share a heart-to-heart talk. After this discussion, Mike decides to sell the motel that his father had just given him. Later, he calls Django and asks to talk to Sue. He's surprised to hear that Sue left Django to move back to Maryland to be with her mother. Mike drives to Maryland, where he meets Sue and her mother. He inquires about Sue's health. He informs her that he is turning the motel into a homeless shelter together with Al, and that he wants Sue to help manage the shelter with him. He also mentions that he still loves her and wants to care for both her and her baby. Sue accepts to help with managing the shelter and apologizes to Mike for how things ended. And of course, she tells him she loves him. Well, that's gonna wrap up this recap. We really hope you've enjoyed it. If so, please click the subscribe button with notifications on so you don't miss a single video. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you in the next one.